Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Laurel Kays and I'm based out of NC State University Extension Forestry, where I coordinate outreach for the Southern Fire Exchange and also sit on the board of the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to welcome you to our Prescribed Fire and Piedmont Hardwoods webinar. While we had originally planned to host this as an in-person event, I'm really glad you were all able to join in for the webinar version. This webinar will feature the three speakers who had originally planned to speak during the classroom portion of this workshop: Sharon Bischoff, Dr. Chris Moorman, and Dr. Dan Day. So to start off our webinar, we are going to begin by hearing from Sharon Bischoff about the history of fire in Piedmont hardwoods. Dr. Chris Moorman is going to follow up talking about the ecology and species of these ecosystems, and then we'll wrap up with Dr. Dan Day talking about silviculture. So with all of that said, I'm going to pass the mic to our first presenter. Sharon Bischoff is the Mountain Region Biologist for the North Carolina State Parks. She coordinates collaborative projects on prescribed burning, invasive species treatments, rare species inventory and monitoring, and forest and stream restoration work on state park properties in the western one-third of North Carolina. So Sharon, take it away.
Okay, as Laurel just said, I am Sharon Bischoff, the Mountain Region Biologist with North Carolina State Parks, and we're going to kind of hop, skip, and jump our way through some of the major natural and cultural turning points in our land use history that influenced our Piedmont forest systems across the last millennium in hopefully under 20 minutes, so hang on tight. When we're talking about the Piedmont, we're looking at this area in orange that is bounded to the west by the Appalachian Mountains and geologically bounded by the Blue Ridge Escarpment. And on the east, geologically, it's bounded by what we call the fall line, which again is that boundary between the harder metamorphosed terrain of the Piedmont and the sandy, flatter outwash of the coastal plain. And the term Piedmont really comes from Latin and Italian forms that literally translate to foothills or at the foot of the mountains. And so that gives us a hint. This landscape is rolling hills below the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains. There are bottomland forests and alluvial forests, all systems included in this landscape. And just at the base of the mountains, we see our highest and driest ridges, which are often, we call them mountains. Oh, excuse me. We call them mountains, but they're actually geologically monadnocks, like Crowder's Mountain, which is outside Charlotte, North Carolina. So as we look through the land use history of this region, we're going to kind of look through the lens of North Carolina with some specific examples, but the broader concepts will apply across the Southeast. So when we talk about history, we're often asking the question, how did we get here? What past events led to our current situation? And so I'm going to use this photo to be kind of a representation of a stereotypical mixed upland forest for our Piedmont region. You can see mature oaks, hickories, shortleaf pine in the canopy, a closed canopy. Mid-story is American beech, maples, holly starting to creep in. And in the understory, we don't see a lot of biodiversity in regard to forbs and grasses, but we see a lot of leaf litter, sometimes a very deep leaf litter, and not a lot of regeneration of those canopy species. So if this is where we are today, what did it look like before? Did it look the same or different? And what events really led us to here? I'm not a historian, so I'll give you that disclaimer up front. I'm also going to paint with a pretty broad brush over some of the major anthropologic and natural events in our history that were the driving forces to shape these landscapes. So we look at the first people and first civilizations to arrive in the Piedmont. This would be during the woodland era, the Native Americans that first actually set up semi-permanent and permanent settlements in this region would have been between 1000 BC and 1500 AD, which is right when the first European contact occurred with these civilizations. You can see the artist rendition to your left that's depicting kind of how we understand and estimate these civilizations would have looked like. Like I said, semi-permanent settlements. They begin small-scale agricultural practices, hunting and gathering, and they use fire as a pretty regular land management tool. They use it to clear the land for their agriculture and village sites, to open up forest space for travel routes, and to promote wildlife habitat. And they even use it in their hunting practices to drive game. And roughly 1,300 years ago, we start to see the Mississippian culture move into the southeast Piedmont region. And that's depicted here by Town Creek Indian Mound State Historic Site. And, excuse me, this is just showing that the populations have increased. These are large urban centers. Their societies have developed a hierarchical structure that is even more advanced, with chiefs and priests and large religious ceremonies. And I just bring all this up to help us remember that these were large civilizations across the region using fire as a regular land management tool before Europeans arrived. And we can see here, this is a map showing known Native American tribes across North Carolina at the time of the Tuscaroran War, which would have been 1711 to 1713. Already, some tribes have been displaced by European arrival, diseases, and war, but still we can see in the Piedmont there is a large amount of various civilizations across this Piedmont region. And the early Europeans, immigrants that arrived, adopted these same ways of life, including the use of fire for agricultural and land clearing purposes, as well as wildlife habitat improvements. And so why would they do anything different if it was working for the Native Americans? So do we know exactly what these Piedmont forests looked like before the first civilizations arrived? And do we know to what extent these civilizations manipulated these landscapes using fire? Not really. There's a lot of debate about it, and we're not going to get into that in this talk today, but we can look at descriptions and maps from early European explorers to help kind of fill in some of the gaps and get an idea of what this landscape looks like. So this is a new description of Carolina, circa 1676, and you can see, let me help you get oriented. To the right is north, so the right side of the map is Virginia. The bottom of the map is the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The upper left is current-day South Carolina, and the upper right corner, you can see it's the boundary of the known world is the Appalachian Mountains. And just at the base of those mountains, the Piedmont, remember, where they denote savannas. And this shows up in multiple maps and in multiple written descriptions of the Piedmont landscape from several early explorers in this region, including John Brickell from 1743. He describes the Piedmont as, "Here are in several places large savannas, beautiful to behold, which at certain seasons appear at a distance like so many pleasure gardens, being intermixed with a variety of spontaneous flowers of various colors, with great quantities of grass on them." And he goes further to describe these grasses as tall bunch grasses. So based on those early descriptions and maps, that hints to us that there was a frequent fire return interval in the Piedmont, but we can confirm that by looking at the fire scar dendrochronology. We can look at those fire intervals on those scars. That gets us back several hundred years. We can look at soil charcoal data, which can get us back several thousand years. We can also use predictive modeling like Gaia and others, including Dr. Dan Day, who you'll hear from later, to estimate what these fire intervals would have been. And so from their modeling, we can estimate it's in the Southeast Piedmont, 2 to 4 and 4 to 6 year return interval. And there's one more clue I want you to look at to help us understand what this landscape looked like. This is a map of the extermination of the American bison. And it's based on a full zoological report and records of known occurrences where their last occurrences were in the country. And those are denoted by the date on this map. And let's look a little closer at the Southeast. So you can see here, we had American bison up until the early to mid 1700s. And I know what you're thinking, really, Sharon? Bison? Well, this doesn't make any sense. And you're right, this photo does not make any sense. Bison are large herbivores. They bring a large amount of disturbance to whatever environment they're in. So if we had herds of bison moving through the forest systems of the Piedmont, they would have disturbed those forests. The basal area would have been much lower. Also, I said they're herbivores. They eat roughly 25 to 30 pounds of grass a day. If bison showed up in this forest, they would never have stuck around. What are they going to eat? So let's look at the grasses that are in the Southeast. If we look at fire-maintained grassland genera and compare the Southeast with the prairie region, where it's a lot easier to imagine and comprehend bison occurring, the Southeast blows it out of the water. And so when we look at all of these different clues and put them together, the grass species and the fire frequency data and the early European accounts, all of this helps us start to understand that these early forests would have been much more open with greater biodiversity of grasses and forbs in the understory. And they would have been maintained by large herbivores and frequent fire cycles. So what changed? Well, as more European immigrants moved into Eastern America, the demand for land and the need for agriculture increased. And so if you look at these two maps and graphs, what they're showing you is the percent of land use change to agriculture and the number of counties that this is occurring in. So by 1850, if you look at the Southeast Piedmont, we're looking at 50 to 100% conversion already. And if we go to 1900, it's 100% conversion. Remember this place? This is William B. Umstead State Park in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. This is also William B. Umstead State Park, circa 1900. That's a lot of land use change. So we know that across the Piedmont this occurred, and land was cleared and converted to agricultural and livestock use, often in several cycles during this time. So what kinds of forests and tree species were still on the landscape, even if they were second or third growth forests? Well, we can use Ash and Pinchot's records of timber trees and forests in North Carolina to help kind of fill in those pieces. And I know this is a hardwood talk, but shortleaf pine is such an important tree species to the Piedmont. I wanted to make sure it got some recognition in here. So you take a look at their range map. In 1897, shortleaf pine was of merchantable size across the Piedmont, with the exception of what we call in North Carolina the urban crescent, which is our highest urban centers in the state, reaching from the Triangle Research Area to Greensboro down to Charlotte. So even by 1897, that area had been heavily impacted and shortleaf pine was no longer of merchantable size there. Okay, what about a hardwood? Let's look at black oak. It is widespread across the Piedmont, even in the second and third growth forests, and it's a dominant tree species. So what about something like yellow poplar? Well, here you can see yellow poplar is only of merchantable size in the mountains on those wetter, cooler slopes. In the Piedmont and coastal plain, there really isn't any occurring at a merchantable timber size. And they go further in their description to point out that in the Piedmont Plateau, Yellow poplar is found in ravines and on north hillsides, not on hilltops. That's important. Why? Well, let's look at our fire tolerance gradient. Let's look at these different species. Post oak, shortleaf pine, black oak, these species are our pyrophytic species that would have occurred on the upland forest systems, on those higher, drier ridges where frequent fire occurred. Tulip poplar, maple, sweet gum, those are our mesophytic species. And even after all of that land use change and second and third growth forests, we're still seeing those mesophytic species in the bottomland forests and on the north hillsides. So what changed? Well, we're also at this time heading full steam ahead, pun intended, into the Industrial Revolution. And so you can already start to pick out from these pictures that urban crescent I mentioned. That's where those textile mills and tobacco mills and all of that industry in North Carolina just is exploding. And we have the railroad systems networking across the state and across the country in this time. And this just speeds up our rate of exploitation of our natural resources. And we really drive our forests and our wildlife species to the brink, and in some cases to exportation. Okay, so what changes? Thankfully, we had some wonderful pillars in our society at the turn of the century that start to realize that our natural resources are finite, and that if we don't change our way of life, we are doing irreparable damage to our natural resources and these forest systems. And so it's in this moment of history that we see the creation on a state and federal level, our forest services, our park services, our fish and wildlife services, and these all come into being in a really short time frame. And it's because of these forward thinkers that we start to consider sustainable timber management and sustainable wildlife harvests, and that land should be set aside for future generations. And these are completely novel concepts. And in this moment of environmental awakening, unfortunately, we also see the fires of 1910. And in that year, we see over 1,700 wildfires across the country. And in a matter of days, we see over 3 million acres burn out west in the summer in Montana, Idaho, and Washington. And so this is just 5 years after the Forest Service has been created. And so it's understandable that as a country, we have this knee-jerk reaction when we finally realize that we could lose our natural resources, and then we see something like this, that we equate fire suppression with responsible land management. And that leads us into the era of fire suppression. And we go for decades where our practice is we stop a fire in the forest as soon as possible and keep the footprint as small as possible. And we get really good at it. We've come a long way from our humble beginnings. But in doing so, this really shifts our forest systems in the Piedmont. It changes the dynamics in these systems and changes the species composition drastically. And it lands us back here, where we have those oaks and hickories and shortleaf pine in the canopy, but the canopy has closed in. We see mesophytic species like hollies and beeches and maples gaining a foothold in our pyrophytic sites, and we've lost our grasses and forbs in the understory, and it's just being filled up with fuel in our leaf litter and duff layers. And as my predecessor would always say, the babies don't look like their mamas. And with that, I just mean our current understory is our likely future canopy if we don't do anything to change our trajectory of these forest systems. And so that opens up a whole ton of questions and large discussion that we're going to kind of start to delve into today with Dr. Chris Moorman and Dr. Dan Day. in their talks, where we're going to consider how to successfully regenerate oaks in these upland systems using prescribed fire and silvicultural practices, and what are those wildlife implications with these management strategies. And with that, I'm going to say thanks for hanging on that wild ride, guys, and I'm going to hand it off now to Dr. Moorman.
And Sharon, before you sign off, we did have one question that we have time for you to answer, and it's a little bit of a big one. We can wrap around to it at the end as well, but where would chestnuts have fit into those maps that you were showing of merchantable species?
That's a really good question, and those would have been more predominantly in the mountain region. But it is Ash and Pinchot, 1897. Timber Trees and Forests of North Carolina is the source, and they have range maps for every tree species. It's a really comprehensive record for anyone to be able to look back up.
Great, thank you. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Dr. Chris Moorman is the professor and coordinator of the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program at North Carolina State University. He holds an MS from the University of Georgia and a PhD from Clemson University in wildlife ecology and management. Chris teaches and conducts research related to wildlife habitat management, including the use of prescribed fire. And Chris is also the past chair and a lifetime member of the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council. Chris, you have the stage.
Thanks, Laurel. I'm glad to be here today to talk about the prescribed fire effects on wildlife in Piedmont hardwood forest. And I first need to acknowledge my two co-authors for today's talk, Drs. Craig Harper and Katie Greenberg. Some of the research I will present today comes from their experiences and not my own. And I also want to note that the conversations that I've had with each of them has really shaped the story that I will tell today. And also note that Dr. Harper is lurking in the audience, so I'll keep an eye out for him. What I'll present today is actually a compilation of a number of studies. I estimate somewhere between 10 and 15 published studies went into what I'm going to present today. So there are a huge number of collaborators. I've listed some of those names here. I apologize if I missed anybody, but a lot of people worked hard to create the message I'm going to tell today. The last thing I'll say is that I'm here to talk about Piedmont hardwood forest, but I will note there's been very little research on fire in Piedmont systems and even less research on the fire effects on wildlife in Piedmont hardwood systems. So I will be using examples from outside of Piedmont hardwood forest for most of my talk. So we know that wildlife species diversity reflects diverse conditions both within a stand and across the landscape. If we have a homogeneous landscape or we have homogeneity within a forest stand, we're going to have less wildlife species diversity than if conditions are variable or diverse in multiple scales. For example, if we want indigo buntings or northern bobwhite on our landscape, you can see here and here, we're going to need to promote shrubland vegetation conditions. If we're trying to manage for both lizards and woodland salamanders here, slimy salamander, then we're going to need very diverse conditions because these species require those diverse conditions. And how do we get those diverse conditions in upland hardwood forest? Sharon covered this quite a bit, but we get it through disturbance, both historically and in present day. And one of those key disturbances, both today and historically, was fire. So that'll be my focus today, obviously, is on prescribed fire. And no two fires are created the same. Fire behavior can vary, and its effects on vegetation can vary quite extensively. And the three things that are really going to go into how fire affects vegetation and in turn habitat for wildlife are fire intensity, severity, fire season, and fire frequency. So I'm using these basic topics to frame my story today, but I will note that they all interact. So you can't consider any one of these factors alone. You have to think of them as a whole as you implement a fire regime. Notably, these fire behavior characteristics or these fire regime characteristics are going to affect forest composition and structure. And our research and our own experiences tells us that that's much more important in terms of affecting wildlife than the burns per se. I will cover the direct effects of burns on wildlife briefly as we consider season and its effects on nesting activities in the spring for ground nesting birds like turkeys. In this slide, you can see in the top left a landscape with variable fire intensity and variable effects on the forest, which would be related to severity, which would create variable conditions for wildlife. On the bottom left, you can see the results of a low intensity fire. These effects will be ephemeral and relatively minor compared to the bottom right, where you had a more intense fire that had more lasting and significant effects on the vegetation community, which I'll talk about some today, and I'm sure Dan Day will also discuss this. So I'll start off discussing fire intensity and severity, and I use these interchangeably, understanding that fire intensity is related to the characteristics of the fire itself, and severity is related to the post-fire effects on a vegetation structure and composition, but notably the effects on overstory. And I'll talk a bit about overstory mortality because that plays a big role in how it affects wildlife habitat. And again, there will be some reference to frequency because all these things interact. The first study I'm going to focus on is the fire and fire surrogate study in the North Carolina foothills on Green River Game Land in Polk County, North Carolina. This area was probably along the margin of the Piedmont region that Sharon showed you in the last talk. So the fire and fire surrogate study is one of many of these types of research studies that occurred across the U.S. that was supported by the Joint Fire Sciences Program. In this one, there were 4 treatments. There was all of these studies, I should say, were directed at reducing fuels and how different treatments, what the efficacy was of those fuel reduction treatments. But they were also designed to track plant and animal response. So those treatments on Green River Game Land were mechanical understory reduction, and this was hand removal with saws by work crews, and that removal was primarily focused on mountain laurel and rhododendron. Then there were just repeated burn only. So this was over a 15-year period. I'll present today. There were 4 fires over a 15-year period. Those were late dormant season fires. And then a combination of that mechanical understory reduction and repeated burns. And I refer to this as MB often. In this case, initially that understory was hand cut. Those fuels were left laying on the ground. And then as you can imagine, that first burn that occurred thereafter was quite intense. So that'll come into play big time as I give this presentation. And then last was control. Today I'm going to focus primarily on these two burn treatments. Green River Game Land, again, is in Polk County. The elevation ranges from 1,200 to 2,600 feet. It's primarily oak hickory with pine on the ridges. Prior to this study had not been burned or thinned in greater than 50 years. And in my talk, I will cover breeding birds, amphibians, lizards, and shrews. So first I wanted to show you a before and after photo of those lower intensity burn only. These burns occurred in February and March. Here on the left, you can see a pre-treatment condition with dense mid-story, fairly dense understory, and in many cases there was rhododendron and mountain laurel. It doesn't show up so much here. And on the right, which is year 12 of the study, this is 2 years after a 3rd prescribed burn, so it's before the 4th burn that did occur during the study I'll present today. And you can see there's greatly reduced mid-story structure, and much of that mid-story biomass has been shifted down to the understory. There were a few hot spots, especially in the initial fire, but thereafter in some other fires that created canopy gaps, and there was some delayed tree mortality that allowed additional sunlight to the understory. But as I said, there was reduced mid-story. And then, of course, after every fire, there would be short-term reductions in the litter layer and in that woody understory shrub layer. And you'll see that when we look at wildlife response. Conversely, that mechanical and burn treatment, especially that first burn, the burn was very high intensity. Again, you can see a pre-treatment on the top left with dense mid-story, some understory. And then as we move to the right, you see 3 years after that first fire, there is some overstory mortality, and you're beginning to see some delayed overstory mortality. 5 years after that first treatment and 1 year after the second burn, you see additional overstory mortality. And then here on the bottom right, you see 12 years after the beginning of this treatment and 1 year after the third burn. And you can see, at least in this experimental unit, there was substantial overstory mortality. So lots of sunlight reaching the understory in this case. So now I'm gonna go through a series of graphs where we look at different wildlife responses to these treatments. And I want you to not necessarily focus on the y-axis, but focus more on the trends. And we're going to primarily focus on the 2 green bars. The dark green bar is that mechanical and burn, which is high intensity, and then the lighter green is the burn only. The the red is control, and the orange is that mechanical removal. And then down here on the x-axis, you'll see these little fires, and that represents every time there was a prescribed fire, and you'll see the chainsaws are when we did mechanical removal, and that occurred twice during this 15-year period. So the take-home message of this first slide is that breeding bird abundance and species richness was greater following the high-intensity burns. You'll see the dark green line runs above all the others consistently. You'll also see some kind of up and down with a lighter green, especially for mean species richness. So what we see is that there are periods of ups and downs in terms of the species richness in the burn only, and what we're seeing is a kind of a response post-fire. As that understory woody layer returns post-fire, you see bird species associated with that layer returning as well. And then after a fire, the richness of those species goes down because those species disappear, and then they return. You'll see this again in some other graphs. Here are the species that actually increased after those high-intensity burns, and I would categorize these birds into two groups: shrubland species like indigo bunting and eastern towhee, and woodland birds like eastern wood pewee and eastern bluebird. And you can see these are probably the species that were driving those trends we saw in the previous slide. Dramatic increases in the mechanical burn, those high-intensity burn areas where overstory was reduced and the understory was increased dramatically. You'll also see some smaller responses, some lesser responses in the burn-only treatments. And here you see a real drastic peak in the eastern bluebird, and that's probably related to the overstory mortality and the production of snags in the cavities that were available for some period of time after that initial hot fire. And then over time, those snags would fall over and those cavities would be less available, although bluebirds did stay above the other treatments throughout. And you can see they really didn't even occur in the mechanical only or the control. Some species showed very little response, and this is a statistical statement, so you can see the p-values here for treatments. In all these cases, these are not statistically significant p-values, although you might look down here at blue-headed vireo and see that during some years that dark green line is below all the others, and that makes sense to me because blue-headed vireos are a mid-story species. So when you're greatly reducing the mid-story with frequent and somewhat intense fire, you're going to reduce habitat for blue-headed vireos, but that was not a significant response. And then up here, you'll see scarlet tanager, and I do note that there are cases where scarlet tanager numbers were slightly above the other treatments. They were slightly higher in the mechanical and burn treatment than the other treatments, so this was not significant. And I do note this kind of response for scarlet tanagers when there's some fairly high level of overstory reduction. So you get down to maybe 60 or 70% canopy cover. That's a benefit to scarlet tanagers. Other birds showed short-term negative responses. These are all ground nesting or birds that nest in the shrub in the forest: worm-eating warbler, ovenbird, and hooded warbler. And they did show significant, statistically significant declines in the more intense fires. But you'll see where I have the red circles, they tend to come back after fire over a period of 3 to 6 years. So these fires occurred every 3 to 6 years on that. Well, the range was every 3 to 6 years during February and March. And as that woody understory returns post-fire, these species associated with that woody understory will return. So, for example, if these were your focal species, you'd want to have a little bit longer fire return intervals to give time for them to take advantage of that understory woody response post-fire. None of the amphibians showed a significant response to treatments. And this is a statistical statement. You will see what some of these bars, it looks like there are differences because some of the bars are much higher than others. I will note that we only had 3 replicates for these experiments, so that we didn't have a lot of power to track differences. And there also was so much variation that contributes to how amphibians respond to any kind of treatment. And that variation mostly has to do with the proximity to moisture. So if you're close to a breeding pool for things like American toad, then you're going to have more American toads. And if you're close to a stream or some other low area, you're going to have more American toads. That really confounds our ability to see treatment response. But I want to focus here on the plethodon species. There were 2 species of woodland salamanders, and that's in the genus Plethodon. And you see these 2 circles I have here. And in an intermediate period in the study, Charlotte Matthews showed that there was significantly greater number of these woodland salamanders in the burn-only treatment than the other treatments. And that may seem surprising. I actually have seen that in another study I did while I was at Clemson, and it's hard to know exactly why this may be occurring, if it's an anomaly or if there's something real here. I suspect it has to do with detection, is that when we burn the leaf litter layer, and the conditions are still okay for these salamanders, they're more active on the surface, they're more likely to be captured. But we need more studies to understand if these are real effects or just related to our ability to detect these salamanders. And the last point I want to make is that I have another circle here. So at the end of the study, you will see that the numbers of these woodland salamanders is fairly low in that mechanical burn, especially related to the burn only and the controls. And this would match what we would expect when there's substantial overstory mortality from intense fire. You would expect these woodland salamanders to decline as the ground level microclimate became hotter and drier. Conversely, lizards benefited from these high intensity burn treatments where the canopy or the overstory was removed, because they're the opposite of these salamanders. They're going to seek out hot, dry microclimates that actually provide ideal thermal environments for them. Here on the top is a 5-lined skink, and on the bottom is eastern fence lizard. And you'll see throughout the entire study that the dark green bar with that intense fire is where we had the most captures of these two species. So they were doing quite well there. We also saw increases in juveniles, so there was indication that there was strong reproduction in these intense fire areas where the canopy was reduced. You will see down all on the bottom for the eastern fence lizard, you see a slow kind of gradual increase in the number of captures in the prescribed burn-only treatments, and that's probably indicative of gradual decline in the overstory from hot spots and just delayed mortality that occurs with fire over time. I wanted to mention shrews because they tell another kind of minor story. This is just a small subsection of the study that went on, and this is in 2006 and 7, which you should know is about in the middle of the length of the time we monitored wildlife. And this is after the second burn, so you see these two flames here. That represents that the fires occurred the dormant season of 2006, and then we monitored shrews that following growing season, and then again in the growing season of 2007. And if we look at all shrew species together, there's no statistical difference among any of the treatments, although you do see a trend that shows a reduced number of shrews overall in the two burn treatments. If we look specifically at southeastern shrew, there was a very weak statistical decline, and that's p-value of 0.09. After that second burn, only months after the second burn, as you can imagine, this shrew lives in the leaf litter layer. So when you have a fire that consumes the leaf litter layer, cover is removed for that species. So there was a decline, but you'll see that within the following year, that the numbers of southeastern shrews jump back up, and that would be as the leaf litter reaccumulated that following fall. So what are the take-home messages related to intensity from the Green River study? The low intensity fires that typically did not reduce canopy did reduce mid-story and what I call associated clutter. This could benefit some bats. I mean, I didn't present data on bats, but that could be beneficial to some bats that feed in the mid-story. You may see reductions in shrew numbers, I say temporarily, as leaf litter is consumed, but you would expect those numbers to rebound as the litter reaccumulates. You would also similarly expect to see reduced numbers of shrub and ground nesting forest birds, again temporarily, as long as the return interval was long enough to allow that understory and leaf litter to reaccumulate. There's some indication that low intensity burns may benefit salamanders because we see increased numbers of captures after these low intensity fires, but this could be related to detectability, so I think the story's still out to be determined on that one. A delayed tree mortality that does occur in these low intensity fires where there may be hot spots could lead to some subtle increases in bird species richness over time, as we saw, and also some similarly subtle increases in lizard abundance over time. But if you don't get any forms of tree mortality from these low intensity fires, then you should not expect to see these changes. Conversely, the high intensity fires that reduce canopy improve the thermal environment for lizards, increase shrubland, vegetation for shrubland birds like indigo bunting and habitat for some woodland birds like eastern wood pewee. There is some indication that these high-intensity fires that remove overstory could reduce habitat for salamanders, but I say maybe here because the results of various studies have been mixed. And then I think because many of our Piedmont forests are fairly homogeneous, these high-intensity fires may increase community diversity, certainly within the stand compared to pre-fire, closed canopy, and definitely across the landscape. But I will note that the responses we see in these high-intensity fires are very similar to what we see after a shelterwood harvest, especially when that shelterwood harvest is paired with burning. So instead of using high-intensity fire to reduce our overstory, we may instead use commercial timber harvest, generate income, have less risk of very high-intensity fire, and get some of the same benefits to wildlife. Ultimately, canopy reduction will be needed for many species of wildlife. And without it, you're just not going to see those animals occur. So now I'm going to move to fire season. Again, frequency is going to come into play here because these things are always intertwined. I'm going to present two different kind of messages here. One's going to be focused on ground nesting birds, and the other is going to be related to woodland restoration, entirely from some of Craig's work in Tennessee. So Sharon showed some of this, but this is a map of lightning flash intensity across the United States, and you will see that in many areas of the eastern U.S., lightning density is pretty high. But I will note that the Piedmont has relatively low lightning density relative to some other areas. Where these lightning strikes occur, they certainly can ignite fire, especially if the conditions are appropriate, and that would be true in the Piedmont just as well as these other areas, but the chance of lightning ignited fire would be lower in the Piedmont because flash density is lower. And also, as Sharon mentioned, here we go. So Native Americans played a huge role in shaping today's fire-dependent plant communities. And this is a quote from Thomas Morton related to Native Americans in New England. And he wrote that the Native Americans are accustomed to set fire to the country in all places where they come and to burn it twice in a year often, as the spring and fall of the leaf. So the point here is that Native Americans, more often than not, did not burn during the lightning season, but instead they would have been burning in the late growing season, probably in the late growing season in the fall, and also in the early growing season and the late dormant season. So we do know that prescribed fire, if we're talking about a ground nesting bird like wild turkey, we know that prescribed fire is critically important to promote a mix of woody and herbaceous understory to provide brood cover and nesting cover. And Craig shared an example with me from Forsyth County in North Carolina, which is in the heart of the Piedmont. This is a picture in March of 2014 of this property being burned during the dormant season for the 5th time. So this is an example of a 5th dormant season burn in the site, and that was in March. And then if we follow that into May, the same year, several months after that dormant season fire, we see conditions that are ideal as nesting cover for wild turkeys. So this site, submesic oak hickory poplar in the Piedmont of North Carolina, has been burned 5 times during the dormant season over a 15-year period. If we're trying to provide nesting cover for wild turkeys, we might burn on a 3 to 7 year return interval to maintain some woody structure. If we want to promote more herbaceous plants, forbs, and some grasses, we would burn more frequently, maybe every 1 to 3 years. But what about if we burn during the early growing season when turkeys are nesting? I know there's a lot of interest in trying to match this lightning season, which could put fire and ground nesting birds in direct conflict. Unfortunately, there just aren't any studies that I know of that have looked at the effects of fire in hardwood systems, especially in Piedmont hardwood systems, on ground nesting bird species. And so what I'm going to present today is an example of a study that we conducted on Fort Bragg military installation in the Sandhills of North Carolina, which is only a couple of counties away from the Piedmont vegetation communities. We tracked hen turkeys on Fort Bragg using radio telemetry, and we found nests, and then we monitored those nests and how they were affected by fire. And I'm going to describe this graph here. This is number of nests on the y-axis. And then the blue is the total number of nests we found in both upland areas and then lowland drainage areas. So on Fort Bragg, these uplands would be heavily affected by fire. And the lowlands may be less so, although they do burn sometimes in drought years, but they would be less likely to burn because of more soil moisture there. So we did, out of the 28 nests we monitored, we did document a single nest being burned up by prescribed fire. So that's 1 out of 28. So that's relatively low risk of turkey nest destruction by fire in a place that's burned quite frequently. I also want to note, though, that if you look at the purple, which is the number of successful nests, there were no successful nests in those frequently burned uplands. So out of 10 nests, there were 0 successful nests. 9 failed in orange from predation, and then 1 failed from being burned up. Conversely, if you look in the lowland drainages that are less affected by fire, you'll see that 15 out of the 18 nests were successful. So here is an example of where many of the turkeys nested on Fort Bragg. We call this an ecotone, but it's essentially a margin between the lowlands and the uplands on the base. And these areas are fire affected, as you can see. Fire is going to be less intense here. It's maybe be more patchy, and in some years it may not burn at all. Because of the greater soil fertility here and the more moisture, you do get a more diverse plant community that includes woody plants and herbaceous grasses and forbs. Here you see a closer example of one of the turkey nests that occurred in that ecotone, and then on the right you see what much of the upland looks like on Fort Bragg. There's fairly sparse a woody component in the uplands, and we know that turkeys typically select some woody structure for their nest sites. So with this sparse upland cover, there weren't a lot of nest sites, and maybe those nest sites that the turkeys did select or choose, maybe they were highly susceptible to predation. So that could be what's going on there. So my point is that fire could directly affect turkey nest from nest destruction, but even if it's not directly affecting nests, you should recognize how your fire is indirectly affecting nesting and brooding cover in any given place. So just a couple of intuitive graphs as you think about season of burn and how it might affect vulnerable species, especially during the early growing season when ground nesting and shrub nesting birds are active, and also when some species may be leaving hibernacula. Here I'm thinking of eastern box turtles as they leave their hibernacula in April and May. If you have a dormant season prescribed fire that occurs before those activities, then you wouldn't expect any direct effects. Of course, if that burning activity occurs at the same time as prairie warblers or turkeys are nesting or box turtles are leaving their hibernacula, you certainly could affect greater risk, even though we didn't see that necessarily on Fort Bragg. And then lastly, if you're looking for a way to get growing season burning in play without posing the risk for some of these spring activities, you could consider late growing season burning, which is going to occur after those reproductive activities or those emergence activities have terminated. So changing gears a little bit, still there's part of the story is still related to season and burn, but it's also related to some silvicultural activities. So there may be a little overlap with what Dan Day is going to talk about, and also related somewhat to frequency. So this is a study done at Chuck Swan State Forest in the Ridge and Valley of East Tennessee. This is a study led by Michael McCord, who was Craig Harper's graduate student. And this involved a number of different management activities with the intent to monitor vegetation response, because that vegetation would have provided habitat for a variety of wildlife species. So you can see where I whited out some of the additional treatments I'm not going to talk about today, but I want to just, in this first graph, I'll describe this overall experiment where we have a control. C is control. F is burn only, fire only. So it would be these control areas that were burned only, no other overstory treatments. Then we have a shelterwood harvest as S, and then we have shelterwood and burn. So these sites received shelterwood cuts in 2001, and then they were burned one time in 2005. And the shelterwood reduced overstory canopy cover to 60%. And then here we have RF, which is a retention cut. Again, that retention cut was like a commercial thin, reducing the overstory down to 60% cover, and it was followed by fire. And that retention cut occurred in 2001. So what we're seeing here are conditions after 2 fires, after a retention cut in 2001 and 2 fires, and we're monitoring this in 06, 07, 08, 09. So what's the take-home message here for this slide? This is a slide looking at, on the y-axis, the number of mid-story stems per hectare. And the take-home message is that the low-intensity, early growing season fires that were implemented in this study reduced mid-story stem density. All of these fires occurred in April and May during the early growing season. So here, in 2009, in the burn-only, this is after 4 early growing season fires, so you can see substantial mid-story reduction compared to the control. Here, if you compare the shelterwood and fire to the shelterwood only, you again see that the fire substantially reduced that mid-story stem density, and similarly, over time, the retention cut and fire has led to greatly reduced mid-story stem density, and this is what we would expect. So if you're managing for a mid-story species, you probably shouldn't be implementing fire. Conversely, those fires did not reduce the woody understory cover. And we often hear that these early growing season fires do reduce the woody component of the understory. In this case, these 4 fires did not get there. So you see that the fire only has very similar woody understory cover and maybe even slightly greater woody understory cover than control. If there's greater, that would be because the biomass of the midstory has been shifted to the understory. Shelterwood and burn have very similar understory densities, and the retention cut and fire again has similar or even greater understory densities. Both are largely because of an increase in light from canopy reduction, and also because that mid-story stem density is being shifted to the understory. So again, the take-home message is multiple early growing season fires are not reducing woody understory cover, but that woody understory cover did respond positively to a reduction in canopy. So you can see no reduction in canopy here, reduction in canopy there, so we get more understory because there's more light. So you can think about all this if, in terms of what kinds of species you're trying to manage for. Herbaceous plants, grasses and forbs, brambles, blueberries, and desirable woody vines did not increase following up to 4 early growing season fires. So this is 1 fire in the shelterwood and fire, 4 fires here in fire only, and 4 fires in the retention and fire. And you can see that the cover of these species is fairly similar across all these treatments. So we often hear that these early growing season fires increase herbaceous cover, but Craig did not see that after 4 fires on Chuck Swan. Maybe with additional fires over another decade or more, you would expect to see slow increases in herbaceous cover, but it's going to take a long time. The last one is a separate study led by Marcus Lashley for his master's project. These are the same study sites, the same treatments, control, fire only, shelterwood and fire, and this again is the retention cut and fire. And the take-home message here is that deer forage increased most following a combination of canopy reduction and prescribed fire. Prescribed fire alone gave some increases in deer forage, but it was moderate compared to the combination of canopy reduction and fire. So the story is you need light, and then you need fire. So the light creates the growing conditions for those woody and somewhat herbaceous plants, and then the fire keeps them near ground level and maybe stimulates germination of some herbaceous plants, but this response was largely woody and not herbaceous. So another story related to woodland restoration, again, that Craig has shared, and this is from Tanasi in the Ridge and Valley in East Tennessee. And this is just more of a pictorial story of a woodland restoration experiment, how it may affect conditions for focal wildlife. So this is in April of 2006. This site had been hit by pine beetles. Some overstory reduction, but there are additional trees marked for removal to reduce the overstory and start a woodland restoration. This site had been burned twice during the dormant season before this photo, but based on the results of Chuck Swan that Craig and his colleagues saw, very little reduction in woody cover from early growing season fire. They tried some late growing season burning in September. So here's a late growing season fire, the first late growing season fire in 2008. The third fire on this site. Here is the second late growing season fire of September in 2011. This is the fourth fire on the site. You still see some woody structure in the understory, of course, although Craig notes to me that you should expect that first late growing season fire to reduce your woody cover by about 20%, and you should expect a concurrent increase of about of herbaceous or forb cover by the same amount, 20%. The following growing season after that September 11 fire, you see the site. Lots of sunlight, lots of understory of woody, but an increased amount of herbaceous cover. And here, this site, they measured it, produced 1,400 pounds per hectare or per acre of selected deer forage. And for comparison, this site with a closed canopy forest would produce about 50 to 100 pounds per acre of forage. This is another picture of the same site in June 2014 after a fifth fire. And this fire was in the dormant season. And then this is in 2018 after a sixth dormant season fire. So you'll see there's 6 fires, 4 in the dormant season, 2 in the late growing season. So the point is it's okay to mix season of burn, but by mixing in some of those late dormant season fires, they began to see a shift away from the woody understory structure to more herbaceous cover. So what are the take-home messages? Do you need to, the first thing you should ask yourself is, why am I burning in the early growing season? This could pose risk to turkeys, although we didn't see so at Fort Bragg, but elsewhere where turkeys may be nesting in burn units, there could be greater risk. We could see similar risk to eastern box turtles. I would stress that scale matters when there are concerns about direct effects of fire. If you're managing a large landscape, you should only be concerned if you're burning large areas at once. But if you're managing a small property and you're burning a large percentage of that property in a single year, that could be a problem for that landowner. Frequency may interact with season. And we see this on Fort Bragg, where we have Bachman sparrows that nest on the ground in fire-maintained areas, but their nests hardly ever get burned up because they're nesting 1 and 2 years after fire. And if you have a 3-year return interval, fire never comes in contact with that nest. Fire shadows in these burn units leave unburned patches for food and cover. As I mentioned, we can use late growing season fire and dormant season fire as options to reduce risk of direct mortality to nest or individuals. And late growing season fire, based on Craig's work, also does a better job of increasing forbs over woody cover than early growing season fire or dormant season fire. We can use prescribed fire to maintain open woodlands. Canopy reduction is a first step, either through silviculture, or I guess you could use intense fire, but we would recommend a silvicultural approach. And then the fire is going to maintain the forage, preferably forbs. And I say by definition, if you're shooting for a woodland, you must have a dominant understory of herbaceous plants anyway. And ground cover for nesting and brooding turkeys is provided, and then habitat for a wide variety of other species like woodland birds. You have fawning cover for deer. You have habitat for lizards, as I've mentioned previously. So I'll finish up quickly talking about fire frequency. Again, I'm going to focus on pine community examples here because we just don't have studies of the effects of fire frequency over a long time frame. In Piedmont hardwood forest, and I would say more so in hardwood forest in general in the eastern U.S. So Marcus Lashley was a PhD student of mine and a postdoc, and what he did along with our collaborators is he went out and he measured understory fruits along transects and fire-maintained woodlands on Fort Bragg, looking for fruits of blackberry, huckleberry, blueberry, poison oak, and other understory species. And what we saw was a substantial reduction in fruit production after fire. For the same year of fire is 0 and 1 year after fire. And then once you got to 2+ years after fire, you saw a big pulse in fruit production. And the point here is that if you were on a 2-year return interval on these sites, you would essentially eliminate all the fruit, because you can see here the fruit doesn't start being produced until June. On a 3-year return interval, you would expect 1/3 of the uplands to be producing fruit. There was some criticism that this was just a single time since fire study, or year since fire study. So we, for his postdoc, we did an additional study where we looked at the cumulative production of fruits across the entire fire return interval. So the 1-year interval includes the single year after fire. The 2-year interval, or the 1-year interval would be just the year of fire. The 2-year interval would be the year of fire and the next year after fire. And the 3-year would be the year of fire, 1 year after fire, and 2 years after fire, and then it would be burned again. And it's the same results here. You see that with a 1 and 2 year return interval, there's essentially no fruits produced in the uplands. If there was any fruits, it was only in unburned patches within a burn unit, whereas a 3 year burn interval has substantially more fruit production. We also were interested in forage production in relation to time since fire, so we measured deer forage biomass in cages across these same areas. We not only wanted to measure just plant biomass, we also wanted to measure the biomass of plants that deer ate, because you see here a lot of wiregrass, and deer don't eat wiregrass. So to figure out what deer ate, we collected fresh scat, and then we did what's called a microhistological analysis, where we look at cross sections. We didn't do it, we hired a lab to do it, but the lab actually looks at cross sections of cells in the scat, and they can identify individual plant species that are in the deer diet. And then that tells us what deer eat, and then we can actually look at the amount of important deer foods in a time since fire study. So here you can see that the biomass of selected forage declined with time since fire. The year after fire had the most biomass of deer selected forage on our study sites, and then it pretty much declined fairly consistently out to 5 years since fire. You don't find many places 5 years or more since fire on Fort Bragg. So a simple message there. So what's the take home in relation to frequency? Frequent fire limits mid-story encroachment, which I've said many times, which could be a beneficial thing if you're managing for understory species. Frequent fire promotes woody understory for certain, because it shifts that biomass from the midstory to the understory. Frequent fire may promote herbaceous cover eventually over multiple decades, or maybe sooner if you're using late growing season fire. If you're trying to maximize deer forage, we would recommend a 2 to 4 year fire return interval. If you're trying to maximize fruiting, we would recommend a 3 to 5 year return interval. If you're trying to maximize birds or other wildlife associated with a woody understory, we might recommend a 3 to 7 year return interval. These are just basic recommendations, and you'd have to tailor these to your specific site. And ultimately, a variability in frequency and season is really important to benefit a wide array of species across your landscape. And with that, I will say thanks, and I will mention that if you're really interested in this subject, Craig led a and I was a co-author here, and Marcus and others. We published a paper on fire effects on wildlife in the central hardwoods and fire ecology in 2016. Thank you.
Dr. Dan Day is a research forester for the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. He's located in Columbia, Missouri, and he's also the project leader of a research unit that studies the ecology and sustainable management of central hardwood forest ecosystems. Dan's personal research emphasis is the silviculture of eastern forests. Dan, it's all yours.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be invited to be a part of this. Of course, I wish I was there in person with all of you. I miss being out in the field with you. I'm not intimately familiar with Piedmont Forest, so I looked up a little bit about it. And here's something that might hopefully look familiar to you. There's 31 million acres. Most of it's privately owned, families and individuals with small parcels. Only 10% is fed in state. Half of it is upland hardwoods, oak hickory, oak pine, oak mixed hardwood. It's a young forest, half of it less than 40 years old. That's kind of weighted by young pine plantations. Hardwood stands tend to be a little bit older. The management level on public lands is very low. For example, on the national forest in the region, there was 5,000 acres of thinning in a year, 2017, I think, 1,000 acres of even age regeneration. So very low level activity on public lands. If I had to guess what's going on private lands, it's probably a bunch of high grading. Prescribed fire, there's an increased interest in using it and how and why. And the why varies from fuels management, but a lot of the why is ecological benefits for biodiversity, conservation, wildlife habitat. You heard recently from Chris on that, T&E species, conservation concern species, game species. We want to restore fire-dependent ecosystems like oak pine forest, woodlands, savannas. We want to increase the forest resilience and the landscape resilience by favoring fire and drought adapted species. We want to increase the diversity in forest composition and structure across the landscape. And we want to know how to use fire to regenerate desired species. And I'm going to focus a lot on oak species. And but keep in mind, as Sharon said, shortleaf pine was once dominant in the area, and there is interest in oak pine forest. And without fire, we are losing the pine in those systems. So a lot of the things I say about oaks can be applied to shortleaf pine too, in terms of the approach of developing large advanced reproduction under a partial overstory with the use of fire and other practices. And then when it's competitive and that regeneration is adequate, a release. Okay. I just want to go over a few basics on oak regeneration. The sources are seedlings, of course, new seedlings. They're characterized by slow juvenile shoot growth. Oaks, to generalize about oaks, tend to prefer allocation of carbon to build root systems at the expense of shoot growth, and in frequent fire systems, this is a good adaptive strategy for that, but it's not in the absence of fire. There are, once a seedling is top killed and it sprouts back, we call them seedling sprouts, and the larger basal diameter those seedling sprouts are, the greater their potential to resprout after top kill. And then we have stump sprouts, which are sprouts from larger trees, usually that are cut in these days by timber harvest or thinning. And they're the most competitive form of oak reproduction. The problem is not all oak stumps sprout. It varies by species, by size of stem, and by age of the stem. So if a goal is to maintain oak stocking in the stand, and you can't get there with just stump sprouts, you're going to need advanced reproduction. And that's why you often hear that the key to sustaining oak stocking is to have adequate large advanced reproduction. Oak seedlings have good growth in 30 to 50% of full sunlight. The more sunlight beyond that is maximum growth. Problem is the competition also grows better too. So 30 to 50% of full sunlight is a good place to start if you have small advanced reproduction and you want to get it bigger. I talk about oaks, and I just want to remind everyone not all oak species are the same in their silvics. And for example, white oak, Quercus alba, is much more shade tolerant than scarlet oak or post oak. So there's a gradient in moisture and light requirements among the different oak species. The state of the current forest is commonly closed canopy, often with a well-developed mid-story, a shade-tolerant species. And as you saw in scenes from the other speakers, there's low light in the understory, often less than 3% of full sunlight. It's not enough light for oak to survive. You get small seedlings that germinate from a good mass crop, and within 10 years, that cohort of seedlings is pretty much dead in these types of conditions. And we've heard noted before, the lack of diversity in the ground flora. It's dominated by shade-tolerant woody species and some forbs, and this type of habitat favors wildlife species that like complex forest structure. Much of the landscape in the eastern US is in this condition. So we have, from that standpoint, low diversity across the landscape, while we're lacking our early seral habitats and woodland and savanna type structures and composition. I'm going to cover some highlights on oak and fire regeneration ecology. Acorns are not very resistant to fire. If you got a good acorn crop on the ground and you run a fire through there, you're going to kill all the acorns. And even small oak seedlings that are new and small in diameter with smaller root systems are highly vulnerable to mortality with even a low intensity dormant season fire. Some leaf litter is okay with acorns and germination. It may even help the acorns maintain a moisture content they need to remain viable. But eventually leaf litter can be too deep, and a prescribed fire is really good and probably the best tool for reducing that deep leaf litter. So if you don't have acorns on the ground and you don't have a lot of small oak seedlings, but you have deep leaf litter, good time to burn. Acorns are often buried in the ground by many species of wildlife, and soil in general is a poor conductor of heat. So that's a really good place for an acorn to be if there's a spring, dormant, or a late summer or winter fire. Temperatures above ground may rise to 700 degrees Fahrenheit or even hotter. That's sufficient enough to kill plant tissues, but the acorns in the ground are only subjected to temperatures of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, just a ½ inch buried in the soil. So what about oak seedling sprouts? This is results from a study that I conducted in the Missouri Ozarks. And we looked at stems that were very small to up to 6 inches in basal diameter in the understory of a mature upland oak stand. And here you can see the results that vary by increasing basal diameter, probability of survival for the species, some of the major species there: white oak, black oak, scarlet post. And in this system, some of the more major competing species: flowering dogwood and blackwood. And we have the results here in the solid line of 1 burn, or the dashed line 3 or 4 burns over a 10-year period. And these are March and April burns. And what you can see as a general pattern is that mortality is greater in smaller size seedlings for any species. Of course, there's species differences in that response. When we have multiple burns, the mortality increases for small diameter seedlings, even for many of the oak species. But for the larger seedlings, the survival is still consistently fairly high. And what I mean by survival is these things are top killing, but they are resprouting, so the plant itself is still alive. We do see some species differences among the oaks. Look at scarlet oak. It's a lot more sensitive to repeated burns than post oak or black or white oak. But we were able to practically eliminate black gum from the stand with 3 or 4 burns in 10 years. So it's a useful tool to discriminate among species if you're trying to manage the composition of the understory. On larger trees, a main thing we want to consider and look at is bark thickness, and bark increases with increasing diameter for any species, but there are different rates of bark accumulation among the species. So here's 2 pictures of some extremes: bur oak versus red maple. And as what you can see is as bark thickness increases, it takes a hotter fire to kill the cambium. It takes longer duration of a certain heat to kill the cambium, and the mortality decreases exponentially as bark thickness increases. Now, you can kill large diameter thick bark trees. That picture in the lower right there are some large oak trees in a Kansas woodland, and there was a large downfall up against the trees, and we killed those 2 overstory trees. There's a nice study by Pat Brose and David Van Leer in 1999 that looked at the distance of large slash or accumulations of slash from residual overstory trees. And what they found was if you can remove that slash one way or another and a distance greater than 3 feet from the bole of that tree, you'll greatly reduce the damage and mortality in the residual overstory. Oaks are also better than most other species in terms of compartmentalizing any fire wounds. They develop a boundary layer that retains moisture in the tree and retains physiological function of the tree, and also is a barrier to invading fungi and that cause wood decay and wood staining and whatnot. And here's an example of a successful rapid wound closure and compartmentalization in an oak tree. Now, sometimes the fungi, break through that compartmentalization barrier, and then you can get extensive rot in the butt log where the injury occurs in these things. And that's really of concern to forest products industry, foresters, landowners interested in profits from timber sales, because that's where most of the volume and the value of the tree is in the butt log. So here's a little table of decay resistance of the heartwood for different species. And I just want to point out here that there's a big difference between species in the white oak group versus the red or black oak group. And so in the resistant to very resistant category, we have post oak, white oak, chestnut oak, bur oak. In the slightly to non-resistant heartwood resistance to decay, we have red and black oaks. So they may be good at compartmentalizing wounds, but once the fungi penetrate that barrier, then red oaks can decay very quickly. I want to go through a number of scenarios which I have picked out as probably typical things a landowner might be faced with, and discuss briefly just what the role is, fire, and its combination with other silvicultural techniques. So a common scenario is that you have a mature forest and there's no oak advanced reproduction in the understory. So we don't have any acorns or small oak seedlings to worry about hurting, and this is a good time to use prescribed burning to do a number of things. You can reduce the depth of a thick leaf litter. You can start knocking back the mid-story, and if you do it often enough under this closed canopy, within 10 to maybe 20 years, you can start significantly reducing the density of some of your major competing species, and that depends on the species, of course, and the initial size of those species. When we do this, we typically see reported in the literature an increase from 1 to 3% of full sunlight to 10 to 15% of full sunlight in the understory. So we're starting to increase light. We're moving in the right direction. It's not quite high enough for the best growth of pine, shortleaf pine and oak in the understory, but we're moving in the right direction. And it certainly isn't enough light for many of the ground flora species that we're interested in seeing. There is, I want to emphasize that regeneration is not an event. We don't regenerate a stand when we go out there and do a commercial timber harvest. Regeneration is a process, and it takes time, and it's a complex of planned sequence of activities to get the kind of regeneration we want, or the desired structure and composition of the next forest, woodland, or savanna. So if we're burning a mature forest 20 and 30 years before the final regeneration release and the removal of that understory, that's enough time for advanced decay to develop. But one thing in our favor is larger trees are more resistant to scarring in low intensity burns. Here's some pictures from the Missouri Ozarks of low intensity burns. In the upper photo, it's 10 years of annual burning in the dormant season. And in the lower photo, it's 4 burns in 10 years in the dormant season. So you can see the overstory is still intact. The other speakers have pointed that out. But we have knocked the mid-story down, and in the annual burns, we've reduced the density of the understory seedlings. In the periodic burn sites, we still have woody sprouts coming back, but the densities are lower, but they're not eliminated. In another scenario, we have, again, the mature closed canopy forest, but this time we have small oak advanced reproduction. And a common recommendation in this situation, and a lot of the work has been done by Pat Rose, is to conduct a shelterwood harvest where you take approximately 50% of the basal area out, or reduce the stand stocking down to about the B-level stocking. And that in itself will give increased sunlight and adequate sunlight to the small oak seedlings for a number of years. But you need to monitor that. And when you start seeing those seedlings being suppressed by the regeneration woody canopy, then it's a good time that triggers the need for a low intensity dormant season burn. And the emphasis on low intensity is for a number of reasons. One is if you haven't had fire in the site before, fuel loading could be high enough to give you, higher fire intensities than you want. And from the standpoint of, trying to minimize the mortality of the young oak seedlings. And you don't want, so you want a cooler fire at this point. Then in a traditional shelterwood forestry approach, where we're looking at using the shelterwood just to establish competitive regeneration and then take it off, you're looking at 3 to 5 years, possibly removing that shelterwood. And at that time, the oaks are going to start probably being outcompeted by their neighbors. And so the shelterwood removal at that point will again release the oak seedlings, and depending on your circumstances, you may want to follow that up quickly with a prescribed fire. When the oak seedlings are, Pat Rose recommends 3/4 of an inch in basal diameter or larger, they're pretty, have high probabilities of good vigorous sprouting if they're top killed. And so he recommends increasing the intensity of the fire, burning a little later in the spring. I mean, there may be other considerations resource-wise or wildlife-wise why you don't want to do that. But if you want to knock back the non-oaks, these are the kind of things you do. So let's say we've taken off the final shelterwood cut, or we did a clear cut, and now we're in early seral regeneration mode here. And this is a good time to use prescribed burning. And if the oak seedlings sprouts are large enough, then you want to burn as hot as you can, and burn, when in the late spring, when species are more physiologically active, because then you're going to increase the mortality of the non-oak. So this is a good time to use fire. You can monitor the situation. That'll judge when you need to burn again, but this might be like a 3 to 5 year burn cycle until you feel the oaks are competitive to stand on their own, and then you need to remove fire and allow them to recruit into the overstory and grow large enough so that if you reintroduce fire, you're not going to top kill them again. So there's another common stage of stand development, which is at an even age stands, age 15 to 20 years old. We start getting canopy closure, and we're entering into the stem exclusion stage. This is a lousy time to use prescribed fire. It's indiscriminate. You can't control what stems it top kills or scars badly, and so I don't recommend using fire of any kind in this type of situation. You definitely want to go in and consider crop tree releasing your oaks and other desirable stems and species at this time, but you do that mechanically or with mechanical herbicide combinations. If you're looking at high grading, selective cutting on private lands, or more proper uneven age management on public lands, there's not much of a role for fire in these situations. It just doesn't work with the system. For example, in single tree selection, you have all the things going on when you're going in and doing a timber harvest. You're creating regeneration. You're releasing, saplings to grow into the overstory. So you have regeneration and recruitment of small stems going on at the same time. And if you're burning, then you're gonna truncate that process, and so it just won't work. It falls apart. If you have small group openings in a matrix of single tree selection management, that's really hard to use fire in the small openings, and it's just becomes logistically a nightmare. And then another scenario is where we have, often we have mature forest and we want to move them back to a savanna or woodland state. Now, we're not worried so much about pine or oak regeneration at this time, as we are managing the woody structure and promoting the desired ground flora. And fire is an absolute necessity to restore and to maintain these systems, which in absence of fire, go to closed canopy complex forest. So as Chris mentioned, you can try real high intensity fires to open up the understory. Your low intensity fires are not going to do that, but that's kind of a waste and seems silly when you have merchantable timber out there. So why not do a timber sale and go in there to manage the larger diameter material and use fire to manage the ground flora and the mid-story. Depending on the size structure of the mid-story, you might be having some problems if all you can do is low intensity fires in knocking that back. And so you may have some non-commercial work that you need to do out there with mechanically felling the larger saplings and small poles, or using a hack and spray herbicide application to take them out. One advantage of the hack and spray herbicide application to mid-story is if it's done properly, you kill those stems and they aren't sprouting back. If you try to manage that with fire, it's going to be repeated fire, and you better think about that before you go and open up the overstory, because Chris mentioned, you know, how with adequate light, all this woody material just bounces right back. And so if you want to reduce the density of that with fire, you need to be thinking about how to do that while you still have an intact mature canopy. There are some tools out there that exist for certain forest types and can be developed for your forest type. This is one that we developed for upland oak stands in Missouri. And it just is a model that shows the relationship between stand stocking and the amount of light in the understory and canopy cover. The dotted line's canopy cover, the dark line is photosynthetic active radiation in the understory. And it gives you a real good idea for what you need to do to the overstory and mid-story to get certain light levels. And those light levels are determined by what are the light requirements for your desired oak or pine regeneration or your ground flora species for woodlands or savannas. On the x-axis, I have those ellipses there, savannas and woodlands, and that's from some work we've done in Missouri where we use general land office surveys and witness trees to estimate historic composition and structure and quantify it in terms of trees per acre, basal area per acre, stand stocking. And in Missouri, woodlands in the early 1800s, they fell in the range of stand stocking from 30 to 75% stand stocking. And interestingly enough, when you look at this graph and the range of light that occurs in those woodlands, it's in the 30 to 50% range, which we recommend for development of large oak reproduction. If you're interested in shortleaf pine, you need more light than that. You need to be above 50% light level in the understory. Here's a Gingrich stocking chart for central hardwoods, upland oak stands, and from, again, the historic GLO note witness tree surveys, we've identified areas that savannas and woodlands occur on these stocking charts. And these are useful for you to see where your stand is at and how you can manage it to get it into at least the proper desired woody structure for a savanna or a woodland restoration. And there's also tools like this out there. This is for savannas in the Missouri Ozarks. We use similar concepts that stand behind the stocking chart. In this case, we've used it to relate trees per acre and basal area per acre in the overstory to crown cover, which a lot of people use when they're talking about managing savannas. For example, if you want grass dominance, you need to be below 50% crown cover in terms of the overstory tree cover, or you just won't have enough light for many of the warm season grasses. And so this just helps you connect the dots in terms of stand structure and different ecosystems. When we're talking about restoring Savannas and woodlands, of course, it's not just about the trees. They're the main structural framework and the skeleton of the system, but a lot of the emphasis is on ground flora and wildlife habitat. And the ways we manage ground flora is by managing overstory density, as I mentioned, and fire is a big part of the management of these systems, restoring them and maintaining them. And as Chris mentioned, we have all the elements of a fire regime at our disposal: frequency, seasonality, intensity, size, all that stuff. And we can use that to manage the ground flora. And just very generally, if you want to favor grasses, you're going to be burning annually. If you want to favor forbs, you burn less frequently, but not too infrequent, because then you start getting the woodies taken over. If you burn in the dormant spring, you're going to favor C4 grasses. If you burn in the summer, you're going to favor forbs. And there's a lot of relationships like that that we know and we're learning about to help us use fire to get the kind of ground flora composition and structure that we want. And something that we don't study very much of is grazing fire interactions with vegetation. And you'll be seeing more and more of this, in the future. But historically, of course, we had deer, elk, bison grazing in these woodlands and savannas. And now we still have deer, maybe too many deer, grazing. And if we're ever going to come up with prescriptions for private landowners who own most of the resource, we're going to have to consider grazing domestic cattle and how they fit into, a managed restored savanna and woodland on private lands. So we have invasive species. They're with us. They're expanding. They're not just an urban problem anymore. And just some general strategies about that. Many of the species are adapted to disturbance, more light. They have adaptations to fire. So opening up the stand and burning them often just unleashes them. And so a general strategy is, if you've got these problems or concerns in your stands or in the adjacent stands, it's before you start opening that up and burning it, you need to go in and deal with and manage to control or minimize those advanced or invasive species before you start doing anything else. And probably it's just going to have to be part of the maintenance management package from here on out, because they're here and they're always going to be pushing to move into the site. At some point, you're going to have to get recruitment from the seedling sprout stage into the overstory, whether you're managing for forest, woodlands, or savannas. Those overstory trees don't live forever. You have to have some recruitment, and these trees cannot recruit if you're burning every 3 or 5 years. And so they need an adequate fire-free period to get large enough that they will not be top-killed by the next fire. And this may take 10 to 30 years, depending on site quality, overstory density that reduces growth. What is the origin of the reproduction? And here's a graph from Missouri of oak stump sprouts in either a clear cut, a group opening, or a single tree selection. And so you can see in the clear cut that after 10 years, white oak sprouts were over 2 inches on average. Scarlet oak was over 3 inches. So it took them 10 years to get those sizes. It might take 20 years to get up around 4 inches or larger in diameter and be more resistant to low intensity fires the next time. Now, a lot of times when I mention this, I get blowback from the naturalist and the ground flora people, because they can't possibly think of not burning for 10 or 20 or 30 years, because they'll lose a lot of their characteristics that they desire. And so it gets kind of complicated about how you manage recruitment and maintain the ground flora. And there's not a lot of detailed prescriptions on how to do that, but you just have to think about it. And the approach varies by the scale of your operation. If you're managing 100 acres, I know people that go out with leaf blowers and blow around individual trees that they want to recruit into the overstory. But you can't do that on thousands or millions of acres. In that case, you might be, counting on, the stochastic nature of things to allow some recruitment to happen where trees are protected by streams, ravines, rock piles, or you may also want to consider not burning black the entire unit. Heterogeneity in the prescribed burn has a lot of value. If you want oak or shortleaf pine, I would say in a lot of cases, you're going to be looking at, you just can't say, okay, we got the regeneration and then walk away and leave it for 40 or 80 years. You better come back in 10 or 15 years and take a look at it and see how things are going. And oftentimes you want to do some kind of pre-commercial thinning at that point, because it's only the most dominant oaks that are going to survive to maturity at that point if you don't do anything. So you may have a lot of oaks out there. That gives you the most options for managing, depending on how much stocking you want in oak or pine. And if you missed that point in stand development, then you've lost a lot of opportunities to have a say over the final forest composition. So there's a real good paper summary on the role of fire in the cycle of an oak forest by Mary Arthur from the University of Kentucky. It's in the Journal of Forestry from 2012. So the role of fire in managing oak depends on the stage and the life cycle of the oak. It depends on your management objectives. Are you after a forest, a woodland, or a savanna? It's usually combined with mechanical or chemical treatments. We've seen from Chris's comments and observations from other studies that the fire alone treatment didn't give you the best results. It was some combination of mechanical cutting and fire that gave you the best results in terms of ground flora diversity or desired wildlife habitat. So oak and pine management requires a sequence of treatments over time. And it needs to be planned, and there needs to be commitment to it. And these are real challenges, I understand. Staff move around. Private landowners, the tenure of ownership is, 10 years or less maybe. So there are some real challenges there, but it's a process, and there needs to be a commitment and an infrastructure there to get the operations done. So I just want to mention a couple of things. I don't know how much time I have left, but a lot of people are interested in the effect of fire on timber, wood products, value, and volume. Hardwoods, quality of the log, the tree, the log, the lumber is preeminent in determining its value. And we all know, that, well, I was raised in forestry school back in the 70s, and, it was get the cows out of the wood and get the fires out of the wood, because fire can do severe damage, and it can. So we're getting a number of studies since Joe Marshall's 2014 study to get a better handle on the dynamics of fire injury and value and volume loss. So in his study in the Missouri Ozarks, he looked at red oak species. He cut down 90 trees, took the butt logs, and these trees came out of stands that had burned 3 to 4 times in 15 years or less. These trees were 9 inches in diameter or larger at the time of their first injury. What he found was that there was a 9.4% value loss and a 2.4% volume loss. And he also found that if you harvest within 5 years after injury, you don't lose anything. And if the scars are less than 20 inches in height, there's little loss. The greatest damage is done to pole-sized trees. They're the most vulnerable because they're gonna remain in the stand for decades and decades until they become merchantable. And that gives time for decay to enter into the core of the log and do a lot of volume loss. So we're getting a better understanding of how decay and lumber defects affect these trees over time with different size scars by different species. And that helps us manage the injury to minimize the loss. Mike Stambaugh looked at the the fire effects on diameter growth in a white oak stand in Missouri, and he found that a few trees were scarred. The radial tree growth was not affected by repeated fires over decades and decades. That fire scar closure time is related to the size of the scar, and most wounds closed in 10 years. And I just want to kind of end on this slide, I guess. This is from Stambaugh's study, the wounds in white oak that were less than 15 inches in length, considering the arc of the scar around the perimeter of the tree, that those would close in 5 years. And this is the historic fire history map that Sharon showed from Rich Guyette of the Piedmont area. We're looking at historically fires every 2 to 6 years. And so in that time frame of fire frequency, white oaks at least are able to close smaller wounds and heal completely in between fires. And so these types of thresholds are good to know to help us manage our fire frequency and our tree growth, and to minimize fire injury and damage, because a closed wound, a wound that closes quickly, is a lot less damaging to the tree, and maybe not damaging at all, primarily because it's no longer an entryway into the tree by fungi, which cause wood decay. And so it's becoming apparent that there is, in some cases, I mean, I think that's a low level of loss to incur in 15 years in hardwoods for what I'm going to gain ecologically and other resource-wise from the use of fire. And so it's something I can factor into the overall economics of my system. And with that, I'll end.
Okay, so we have a couple questions. So for Dr. Day, we have a Piedmont hardwood site where upland oaks are being retained as co-dominants with shortleaf and longleaf pine after being clear-cut and burned 3 times. It appears that these coppice sprouts have significantly thicker bark in these burn areas than similar size sprouts in unburned areas. Is there any research showing a physiological bark thickness response due to fire?
Well, I don't know of any studies in the US that really look at that, but I am aware of some that were done in Spain, and I'd have to go get those articles to look at what the results are, but it sticks in my mind that they did find that frequent fire that doesn't top kill stems, at least of the species they were working with, and they were oak species, the tree response to that was to increase bark thickness. So there may be something to that for certain oak species, maybe not all of them.
Okay. We have a question for Dr. Moorman now. Research has shown increases in plant diversity with a variance in burn seasonality. Given that growing season fires are often patchier in Piedmont hardwoods, are there studies to suggest that we could achieve better habitat diversity if we varied our burn seasons?
Hey, Laurel, can you hear me?
Yep.
So first thing to Keith Moss out there who's making fun of Clemson, he knows I'm a dog at heart, but my time at Clemson let me hang out with Van Leer, so that was great. So in response to Brandon Price's question, yes, variation in burn seasonality can promote plant diversity. And yes, growing season fires can be patchy, which would allow that within burn unit mosaic that Dan just promoted, and I certainly would promote that. We tend to have a desire to blacken the whole burn unit. I've been part of that. I will say that the patchiness of fire is going to be related to the burn conditions, the fuels, probably canopy cover, and I'm sure Dan could comment more specifically on that. My experience is that when you're in a drier condition and fuel moisture is lower, that you can get a more complete burn during the growing season.
Dan, did you want to comment?
I would just like to add that in some respects, you know, annual burning reduces the amount and severity of injury on stems. And so actually, it may seem counterintuitive to you at first, but increasing the frequency to annual burning may be a way of maintaining fire in the system, at least during, when you're trying to recruit trees into the overstory. And most of my experience has been with timber, hardwood, leaf litter fuel models. And a couple of times I've gone on field tours into really oak savannas with grassy for fine fuel, models, and the type of fire is really different. And I was seeing in those systems where, yeah, the intensity is high, but the duration is low, and the overall effect is there's trees that are smaller than 4 inches in diameter that are surviving intact. Those types of fires. Now, certainly they get injured, but they're not being top killed. And so some of the recommendations I maybe have made for thinking about diameter and how big a tree you need for recruitment is dependent on fuel model and it may vary really differently depending on, ecosystem type, like oak savannas versus oak forest.
So another question specifically about diameter size. Dr. Day, you referenced pole size in hardwoods. Could you please define that?
Oh boy. You'd have to fact check me on this. I mean, there is like an official SAF Society of American Forester definition on that, but it's something like 4 to 9 inches or something like that in diameter is a pole-sized class tree.
So going back to Sharon's talk about history, Sharon, given that prior to European settlement, the fire return interval was at least every 6 years, is there any evidence or theory to suggest that native cultures also used fire for settlement protection, such as burning grass off around villages?
I think that's a good question. And like I said earlier, I'm not a historian. I think that is a plausible theory and is likely, but I would need to dig deeper into some historical documents and research to verify that that was a use that they used fire for. Also, Dave Godwin put in the chat a couple links I shared where I got those maps and some of those historical descriptions of the landscape. They're North Carolina sites, they're open source, but some of the resources you can pull from there will include the greater Southeast region, so it's not all North Carolina specific. So it may provide some gems for folks looking to dig into those historical documents.
We have one more question for Chris, and this is from Keith Moss. Did the late growing season or early season burns have different effects on birds?
So that wasn't part of those comparisons. I would say that certainly you would reduce any risk of direct nest mortality or brood mortality if you're shifting to the late growing season, because those birds, if you're talking about turkeys, they wouldn't be nesting in the later growing season, and certainly their broods, their poults would be more mobile. I know Craig and I have spoken a good bit. I often get concerns about eastern box turtles. Many of those in the audience may also have concerns about eastern box turtles because they're super vulnerable to fire. And Craig and his collaborators, his graduate student, have just finished a project that will be published soon in the Journal of Wildlife Management, I believe. And it looked at eastern box turtle response to fire. And they found that those box turtles were most susceptible to burning during the early growing seasons, well, I think within a couple of weeks after they came out of their winter dormancy. And individuals varied, but that was from April to May. And that during the dormant season, those turtles would be underground. They'd be kind of buried, so they would not be susceptible to fire. And then later in the growing season, they'd be more mobile. And interestingly, those box turtles were able to seek out, they had behaviors to almost know when fire was coming, and they were able to seek out low-lying areas in the landscape or moisture areas in the landscape where they would be able to persist with fire. So that's not related to birds, but it's box turtles. We need more research on late growing season fire and how it affects plant and animal communities for sure.